Afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're watching. Welcome to the to this edition of the Scott Ritter Show. Today we're going to throw a wider net around the world and move out of Russia and look at global geopolitics. We've seen some pretty amazing things over the course of the past several weeks. China intervening diplomatically in the Middle East, getting Saudi Arabia and Iran to sit down and start talking about peaceful coexistence instead of military confrontation. And if this is successful, we'll probably see a radical transition away from the last 40 years of U.S.-centric policies in the Middle East. We've also seen some fundamental changes in what's going on in places like Africa, where we've seen France basically flounder in its post-colonial environment, and in many cases the vacuum created by the French difficulties has been filled by Russia. And today we're going to have an opportunity to talk to a gentleman who is at the center of this, Maxim Shugalei. He's our guest today. He's a man with extensive experience in Africa and elsewhere, and thank you very much for taking the time to join. I know this topic is probably going to be a little sensitive, so if anytime I say anything that you find you don't want to answer, just say I'm not going to answer that. That's fair. But let's just get to the brass tacks. You've been called an instrument of soft power by the West. You've been said to be the foreign policy arm of Yevgeny Prigozhin's Wagner Group. What's the truth? Well, who are you, and what role do you play in shaping Russian foreign policy today?
Ну, на самом деле, в Африку первый раз я попал
In essence,
в Ливию.
I actually went to Africa for the first time when I went to Libya on the eve of the summit meeting, which had to take place in 2009. And actually, this is the very summit which is going to take place this year in St. Petersburg. Many people were interested in investing into Africa, into Libya, but this was Tripoli, the western part of that country was closed, and no one realized what risks may await the investments there. And we used the visas which we officially obtained in the Libyan embassy. There was a group, and we were hiding from no one, and it was an absolutely open activity. We did polls among the people, we did the surveys openly. The questionnaires were absolutely legitimate. There were no stumbling blocks on any hidden agenda. We did some expert interviews with the people who were actually outstanding for the country at that moment of time. And 2 months after, we were captured. I cannot say that it was an imprisonment or an arrest, because what was going on, that was not an arrest, because no charges were brought and no rights, our rights were not respected. Let me repeat that once again, that I went to Libya, being dispatched by the foundation that I was heading at that moment, and I'm still working for that. And I didn't cooperate with Yevgeny Prigozhin then, and we didn't have any interaction, so it's kind of an illusion, which probably is advantageous for the West. And the West is promoting that stereotype. So again, it was an absolutely legitimate activity, in a sense that no charges were brought against us. And the accommodation was awful, there were interrogations, there were tortures, and in essence, 2 years after, a year and 8 months later, we managed to get freed, because many people invested their efforts, and when I was released, I actually realized how many people helped that.
Well, thank you very much for answering that. But you are still today involved in foreign policy. For instance, I've read you just had a interesting feud with a French government official who made a variety of accusations, and I think we should make it clear that that there's a information warfare, a propaganda war being waged today between the West and Russia, and people need to understand that when they understand the when I speak of charges being put out there, I'm not saying that you're guilty of anything. I'm saying that in the West, this is what we're told about you. But you had an interesting exchange with the foreign minister of France about Mali and about the failure of France in Mali. And the French made many accusations against Russia and against you. And what is the situation in Mali? We know that France has been asked to leave and, in fact, has been evicted. We know that Russia has filled the vacuum. Some information says that Wagner has stepped in. But what's going on in Mali, and also what's going on in Africa? Russia is expanding its footprint. Is this done with malicious intent, or, as you indicated in your exchange with the French foreign minister, is this being done in the pursuit of justice?
Let me repeat once again that I understand the situation in Africa very well. I understand what is going on there. I know what is going on in Mali and what is going on in the Central African Republic. And let me repeat that the Russians entered Africa absolutely legitimately. We were invited by the legitimately elected leaders of the respective countries. And when you say that the French were evicted and the Russians filled the vacuum, we all of a sudden forget that actually there are people living there, and this is up to them to decide who is going to cooperate with them, who is going to protect them, and, for instance, who is going to train the police, who is going to combat crime groups in their country. This is up to them to decide. I think that we cannot say that one country was evicted and the other country filled the vacuum. So there is a proposition which is more legitimate and more fair and much better. I understand why this happens. I understand the situation there. The Russians, once they work in Mali or, for instance, in the Central African Republic, we proceed from the concept of a partnership, that we sign a kind of a contract, meaning that we execute our commitments and they execute their own commitments. And what France did in Africa, France treated the African countries as a natural resources appendage. They would get all the natural resources out. And when France introduced their so-called peacekeeping forces, if you look at the statistics, the crime rate skyrocketed. So the question is what they did there. Naturally, the local authorities were not happy with that, and the local authorities found a way out, and we have to respect their decision. We respect that. There was no violence. When the Russian Wagner group or some Russian detachments entered Africa, the whole work is being done absolutely voluntarily. And we respect our partners. We are very grateful to them for their cooperation. We are grateful to them for their support in the situation that Russia has found itself in.
Thank you. You know, what you're describing seems to be an important moment in global geopolitics, a transition away from post-colonial relationships where the West continued to seek the economic domination of Africa, and the emergence of a sovereign Africa that gets to pick who it wants to do business with. What makes Russia a nation that Africa wants to do business with?
Well, let me stress that once again. We are fighting for a multipolar world. We are against the hegemony of one country, of one power in the world. And this agenda actually is celebrated by most of the African countries that want justice, and they don't want to be corrupted, to be bribed. I can say that if we divert from Africa a little bit, from that subject, I may say that, for instance, on September the 2nd last year, When the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan, the very first day we did a survey there among the Afghani people. Some people were happy, some were not happy, but all of them said that what the Americans brought to the country, that was an ugly corruption. We couldn't even imagine that corruption could be of such a scale, because these would be the people who would be either personally introduced to the members of the government who could do anything. Other citizens were not existent. And certainly this is not a fair society. This is all the respondents told us. Some of them wanted to stay, others wanted to leave the country. But taking the question what the American presence for 20 years gave to them, there was only one answer. It was a corruption. And in Africa, everyone wants a fair and just peace. That's very natural. Every person wants freedom, wants to have a right to choose their identity, to understand what their values are, what they're living for, what their historical values are. Every country has its own track, its own way. And not only African countries, but all the people who are guided by the common sense, I think this is something they would choose, especially when we speak about what the United States offers. They actually want to subordinate the whole planet to their unipolar world, something they're going to run. Is it about justice? No. And justice certainly is very attractive for African nations and for others as well.
Thank you. You brought up Afghanistan, and my understanding is you have recently, or in the near past, come back from a visit to Afghanistan, where you did the survey you speak of. You know, the United States was in Afghanistan for over 20 years, and we participated in almost every aspect of national development that one could imagine, from the provincial level to the top. And as you said, there's a perception of widespread corruption. The Taliban, on the other hand, the United States has refused to cooperate with. We've abandoned Afghanistan. We've left it to the Taliban. And as a result, we're blocking foreign aid, foreign assistance, things of that nature. It seems that once again, Russia has stepped in. Why is it that Russia can work with the Taliban? Why is it that Russia can try to achieve some sort of social justice in Afghanistan when the United States, after 20 years, could not?
Well, the matter is, well, just like any person guided by common sense, we realize that the Taliban came to power, and they came to power not because they are very good warriors. Historically, they are good warriors, but actually the fact is that they have never left the country. If they had not been supported by most of the people there, they would not have come to power in that country so quickly. Just a couple of days after the American troops withdrew from Afghanistan, and they seized the power everywhere, I mean the Taliban. If it were a terrorist organization, if they were using just the methods of terror, that would be one thing. But they immediately said that they are ready to cooperate with any country. They are ready for any negotiations, including the United States, if the terms are equal. And they said, we do not want any terrorism. We want to build our own state. Many questions. For instance, how they treat the women. These questions are quite controversial, quite arbitrary, but nevertheless, the Taliban is now running the state. We cannot deny that. Why should not we cooperate with them? Why should we doom such a country with big historical traditions to a hunger? The situation there is very dire. For instance, when it was snowing in Kabul, there were shortages of food and people were frozen to death, but any humanitarian aid would be blocked. Naturally, some support was needed, and for instance, the United States brought the country to such a dire situation. Now they are blocking humanitarian aid. I cannot find a proper word to define that. But Russia builds certain relations with the Taliban, and that's the very right thing to do. we should not disregard Afghanistan, because it is next to our borders, it is next to our neighbors, next to our partners. Afghanistan certainly impacts them. It would be a silly thing not to interact with them in some aspects. Again, there are some controversial issues in our dealings, but they are ready to discuss them. They are ready to meet. They are ready to raise these questions. They are ready for cooperation. Again, being equal, respecting each other.
One thing I've noticed in this entire discussion we've had so far is a trend that has Russia being invited to come into a country and work in a cooperative fashion with that country. This doesn't just happen out of the blue. There has to be some sort of preparation that's done in advance. Are you the guy that does the preparation? Are you the guy that goes in and establishes the initial relationships with between Russia and other nations?
Нет, я возглавляю фонд еще.
I'm just the head of a foundation, and what we do in these countries, this information absolutely open. I publish that. We do not have any hidden agenda. Naturally, when you arrive to a country, when you communicate to anyone, certainly you have some personal relations immediately. But let me repeat, I don't have any hidden agenda in my activity. And certainly my foundation is not involved in any hidden agenda. Any person who has no criminal ideas is free to appeal to our foundation, and we can do that at their request in any country, absolutely legitimately. I don't see any problem with that. And we are not involved in any shadow activities.
Just a sort of a joke, but if I invited you to come to America, do you think you could help us fix our problems here?
Well, I'm confident that I would draw a very fair picture if I'm admitted to the United States. And I doubt that very much. But will they be happy with the real picture, with the true picture? That's another question. I think that the Americans, or the American authorities, they understand everything.
No, I agree. And
But certainly, if there is a possibility, I will come.
Go ahead.
Well, actually, our foundation is not involved in any shadow, any clandestine operations. We are doing polls and surveys which are being published openly. We have our own point of view that I express, and sometimes it can be challenged. For instance, France did that, and I talked to many reporters, and what I was surprised, I cannot remember that, it was many years ago. We had an interview with some French media, and then this French reporter started showing screenshots of her smartphone that was taken away, of my smartphone, that was taken away by terrorists in Libya from me. And so this French media is not cooperating with the Libyan terrorists, but actually they do have certain ties. But in my activity, there is nothing clandestine, there is nothing illegal. But what these people, the French reporters, did in Libya, when we were captured in Libya, it was provoked by the Secret Service of the United States. And the movie, which was shot by Al Jazeera, actually shows that they even confessed they did that they were behind that.
Unfortunately, in the West, we have a tendency to mirror image our actions onto others. And so when you go forward and you have success, we can't accept that you could use your own methodologies. We have to assume that you're operating as if we were doing this. So I think that's one of the problems, is that we lack imagination to accept the fact that Russia and you could have a different path, a different methodology. You know, in this world we live in today, the United States oftentimes speaks of a rules-based international order. Russia and China have come back with a law-based international order. How do you see the contrast between these two approaches and the role of your foundation in pursuing Russian interests abroad?
Ну, я повторюсь еще раз.
Let me repeat once again. My foundation is